Georgia wins the national championship, ranked number 1. Florida 2, TCU 3, and rounding out the top 25 is Pittsburgh. Adam Lane breaks the school season rushing record with 1815, and Chris Cannon breaks the school season passing record with 4975, and passing touchdowns in a season as well, school season with 53. And Bailey breaks the school season receiving yards record, 1805. And he also has the most receiving yards for his school career, 3408, and receiving touchdowns in his career, 34 total touchdowns at Florida. Lance Harrison, 20 sacks, breaks the school season sack record, and Kyle Hicks breaks the school season rushing record, 23-28, and 32 touchdowns, also a record for TCU. And Tommy Miller with 49 total school career sacks, breaking that record as well. Chris Cannon leads the All-NCAA first team at quarterback. Hicks is up there. Miller, first team All-NCAA defense. Miller, Harrison, Ivy, Lawson's on there. Enzalone. Got Walter from TCU. Washington Harris for Florida as well. And then second team, Bolden leads it for Louisville, All-NCAA. And Robert Wise, true freshman, made it for TCU second team. And then also Neal and Briggs, Florida and TCU. And then Cannon, freshman, of course, made it. And then Dedrick Cooper for TCU center. Robert Wise, of course, we just mentioned, freshman, leading that as well. And then also Williamson, Keys, Jackson, Simmons, and Butler. All right, guys, we'll start off with TCU, and then we'll move on to Florida, and then the Colts for Samuel Mateo. For TCU, quarterback, passing, terrible. Phillips and Tanner both had 12 touchdowns, and Phillips had 1,700 yards passing. Tanner, for the few starts he had 1,100, and look at this, 28 interceptions between the both of them. 16 for Phillips, and then 12 for Tanner. He had 12 touchdowns, 12 interceptions. Overall, very, very bad. And looking at the average yards per game when Phillips was a starter, 155 and 117 for Tanner. So passing wise, big issue for TCU. Noah Walker has to figure it out. For rushing, Hicks, led the league overall, 2,325 yards, won the Heisman, by the way, and many other awards, 6.6 average, 32 touchdowns. They had 350 rushing attempts, and behind him was Trevoris Johnson. He had 419 yards, 2 touchdowns. He had 56 carries total for the season, and then Tanner with 44, he had 226 yards and 3 touchdowns. So he got his rushing stats in for the season, but overall Hicks was the anchor for this offense. He led the team overall. For receiving, we have these numbers. Leading overall, Ziegler 764, and he really started popping off more when Tanner came in. 8 total touchdowns. Echols Looper, the starting wide receiver, 610 receiving yards, and then Hicks, their running back, had 529. Receiving, like I said, passing, receiving is a huge issue. And overall, Ziegler had 8. Burnett, who had a better season last season, but this season he had 7 touchdowns and just under 400 yards receiving. And now let's go to defense. So Adam Harris, true freshman, middle linebacker, led overall with 74 tackles. And then, and then for Briggs, the sophomore strong safety, 64. And then Robert Wise had 63. So Harris had 11 more tackles. I believe some of those he got from special teams. So, and then let's look at the total tackles for loss. Tommy Miller, 42. Hunter had 21. And Lawson, their star defensive tackle, had 21. And then looking at the sack numbers, Miller by far, and I believe he led the league overall, 22 sacks. Lawson had 9 and Noteboom had 5. So Tommy Miller really led this defense this season. Great job by him. Interceptions was a great season for Bear Walter. 6 interceptions. The closest one behind him was Briggs. He had 2 interceptions. and Wheeler had 2. Hodges and Wise also had 2. He had those big picks against Texas Tech and Baylor towards the end of the season to keep the season alive, get them in the playoffs. All right, now let's look at kick return actually real quick. Butler, no touchdowns, average around 30 yards per return for kick return. Overall, almost 1,300 yards total kick return. And then for punts, he had 484, averaging 11 and no touchdowns. So I mean, we'll see what he does next season, if he'll be returning kicks and punts. He wasn't as electric. He really popped off more towards the end of the season, but in the beginning he was struggling. So we'll see what happens next season for that. All right, now let's go to Florida, and this is going to be fun because they had amazing numbers. I know they didn't win the national title, but man, they really popped off on offense and defense. 4,975. If he had 25 more yards, he would have hit 5,000. 53 total passing touchdowns, 17 interceptions, averaging 331 yards per game. He's a true freshman. He was just amazing this season. And 63% completion rates. And now for rushing, also great numbers. We had 1,800 yards for Lane. I mean, very, very underrated. He was great for this offense. Cannon and the receivers really were the highlight for this offense, but Lane had an amazing, sneaky, quiet season. 1,800 yards rushing, 20 touchdowns on 304 carries. He was fantastic. And then Sears, 314 and 3 touchdowns, and Cannon himself, 4 rushing touchdowns, so only 46 rushing yards total. And now for receiving, 1,800 for Bailey, 1,300 for Fullwood, and 744 for Starks, and 333 for Lane as well. But Bailey led with 18 total touchdowns. Fullwood just one behind him with 17, and then Starks had a total of 6. He was really good. He had a good season himself for tight end. And then Lane had 2 touchdowns, and then Andrews had 6 as well. So if we put this in order, Starks, Andrews, and then Carey with 3. But really, Bailey and Fullwood carried this offense in the receiving game, passing game. They did really, really well and complimented Chris Cannon a lot. He had these 2 weapons, and it contributed to his amazing freshman campaign. All right, defensive side of the ball, Florida, Anzalone had 87 total tackles, Roland behind him with 75, and then Marcel Harris with 71. And then if we look at the total tackles for loss, that goes to Lance Harrison, who also led the team overall in sacks as well. Joey Ivy with 17. So it was these 2 really leading it. For TCU, it was Tommy Miller. For Florida, it was Harrison and Ivy. And then a whole bunch of other players had sacks as well. Kyle Johnson, Jared Brown, Caleb Brantley, all great players. And then Harris himself, the strong safety, and Keanu Neal had 4 and 3 respectively. So they did a really, really good as well. And Anzalone had 2 sacks as well. And then we didn't really do the kick return and punt return for this team, but Sears 309, and then he had 711 for punting. No touchdowns on either side. All right, and before we jump into the NFL stats, I just want to complete this one. This is overall NCAA stats. So we'll look at the leaders in passing, rushing, receiving, and the defensive stats as well. And these are for the single players now. This is individual players, so let's recategorize this by total passing yards. So Cannon led overall and by a lot, almost 800 yards. And then O'Corn for Houston had over 4,000, and then Parker had over 4,000. Only 3 players over 4,000. And then you have the next 3 players, Shimonek, I think that's how you say his name, Shimonek, and then Walker, and then Bolin from Iowa, Cincinnati, and Louisville, around 3,800 yards passing. So that's the next tier. And then Ramsey, Finley, Moore, and Anderson around 3,400 yards passing. So you had those 3 tiers, and then Cannon was in a league of his own. And then 53 total touchdowns led the league. Erdely had 41, Walker had 40, Parker 39, and the top to top off the top 10. To round off the top 10, Shimonek had 35 total touchdowns. Who led in interceptions? Thomas with 21 interceptions for Western Michigan, and then Cannon's up there with 17. He had a few games where he threw 3 total in a few games throughout the season, so that racked up that number to 17. And then Chris Cannon led overall with yards per game with 331, and one of 3 players over 300 yards passing. O'Korn and Parker. Houston and Oklahoma State are in there as well. Completion percentage rate. DJ Crook from Penn State, 74% completion rate, 24 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 232 average. I mean, he's pretty good. He's a senior. Could have put up better numbers, but fairly decent. Now let's look at the rushing overall. Let's categorize it, filter it by the most yards. Hicks 2,300, the only player over 2,000, and Pumphrey was 13 yards away from breaking 2,000 from San Diego State. And then Elijah St. Hilaire from Army, 1,900. And then to top it off at 10 was Sean Cobbs from Stanford. And then you also see Adam Lane right in the middle of the pack, 1,800. And then let's do the rushing average. So Victor Thomas from Wisconsin, he only had 459 yards rushing total, and Trevor Johnson had 419. So actually maybe that's not inaccurate, but he was the only player over around 8 yards per carry. So, but let's just go to rushing touchdowns. 12 more than anybody else. Kyle Hicks, Heisman winner, TCU, 32 total rushing touchdowns. And Preston from Eastern Michigan with 24, and Lane with 20. The only 3 players over 20, and then Reed came close from Cincinnati with 19. Who had the longest run overall? That is Jordan Howard from UAB, and Wicks from Washington State with 95, and then James Morris from Wisconsin with 94. And then average yards per game, Hicks averaged 166 per game, and St. Hilaire averaged 148 per game. Now let's go to receiving. So they're going by total receptions, but I'll go by total receiving yards. Bailey led overall the league with 1,800, and you see Fullwood there at the number 7 spot with 1,300. And overall, let's see who led it. Henderson with 1,610 from LA Tech, and then Ronnie Moore from Bowling Green with 1,400. So I'll just do the top 3 right there. And then receiving touchdowns, Bailey had 18, and then Brett Jordan had 18 total touchdowns as well. Parker from Houston with 17, and then Fullwood with 17. Longest reception goes to George Morgan, tight end from Eastern Carolina, the freshman, 90 yards. So must have been a speedy tight end there. And then average yards per game, Bailey with 120, and right behind him, Moore and Javonte Smith from South Alabama. Coach Noah Walker, now for TCU, head coach for TCU, was the offensive coordinator from South Alabama. So this is nice to see a South Alabama player on here with 118 per game. He had a great season too, 15 total touchdowns, and then 1,300 yards receiving. Let's see what else is after here, and then we'll go to defense. All right, total tackles, Nate Johnson with 120, Pleasant with 116 from Wyoming, and then LA Tech, Sammy Douglas. 2 players there from LA Tech, Nate Johnson and Sammy Douglas. And then let's look at total tackles for loss. That goes to Tommy Miller with 5 more than the next guy, Eddie Hall from Coastal Carolina, and then Jordan Watson from San Diego State. And then total sacks, yeah, I was right, Tommy Miller led with 22, Harrison right behind him with 20, and then Ivy rounding off the top 3 with 17, and they were ahead of everybody else. I mean, look at this, 10.5 and 9.5, and then you just jump to 17, 20, and 22. They dominated this season. 9 interceptions for Reggie Wilkerson from Troy, and then you have Maurice Tolbert with 8, and 4 of those, I believe, came from Chris Cannon. One guy got 4 picks. I believe it was either 3 or 4. He had 3 or 4 picks against Chris Cannon, so he got that number up there. And then from Louisville, Richard Benjamin with 8. And then let's look at the kick return. Let's see overall, get a feel of what happened here. Mark Butler, all right, he was the best returner of the year. No touchdowns, but he had 1,200 yards total kick returns. And let's see if anybody had a touchdown. So only 9 players had a touchdown. Sherman Batty, Simmons, Cumberland, and look at the numbers here: 90, 103, and 100. So if you do it this way, 104, someone had 104. And then 103, 100, and 100. So big returns. And Butler's longest was 94, but it wasn't a touchdown. And then let's go to punt return. 711. And then he was far ahead of everybody else. Sears had 711. And then you had Matthews and then Butler. And then let's see if anybody had a touchdown. So Tyshawn Dye, halfback from Clemson, with 2. And then 5 other players had a touchdown as well: Thornton, White, Davidson, and Matthews. And let's see who had the longest punt return. Thornton from Georgia State with 97. It's a big punt return. All right, so let's go over the team stats real quick, and then we'll jump into the NFL. It'll be the last thing. So we're looking at the total offensive yards, and that goes to Florida. 7,250, had 5,000 passing yards and 2,200 rushing yards. And let's just categorize real quick. So total offense is Florida, Mid-Tennessee State, and then Cincinnati. And then rounding out the top 10, at the bottom you see Georgia and Louisville. Georgia won the national title. That's why you see the number 1 next to their team name, their school name. And then passing yards, Florida with 5,000, Houston with 4,900, and then Oklahoma State. And then you see Southern Miss with 36 at the bottom. And then for rushing, you have Georgia Tech 4,200 yards, and then Army with 4,000, and then Navy with 36. And then at the bottom you see Pittsburgh, Utah State, but Georgia Tech led it this season. And then points per game, that title goes to Florida with 40.6, and right behind them, South Alabama 40.5, 11-2 record. They had a really good season. And then you see at the bottom there, Ohio State, Nebraska, and TCU with 36.8. So despite having a terrible pass game and despite having a terrible pass game, it just goes to show you how great the running game was, that they averaged 36.8, making it into the top 10 offense in points per game. So scoring wise, they were still one of the best. And then passing touchdowns, that goes to Florida, 10 more than the next one, Houston and Oklahoma State. And then rushing touchdowns, 42 for TCU. They led it, and because of Kyle Hicks, Heisman winner, 42. And then Arkansas State had 40, and Georgia Tech 39. They led the league in rushing yards. They only had 1,600 passing yards, and they had 39 touchdowns. In Eastern Michigan with 38. And then sacks allowed, the best in the country was Utah State and Georgia. Ramsey, the starting quarterback for Georgia, did really well avoiding the sack in general. Florida ate him up that first game, but in the national championship game, he was phenomenal. All right, so let's go to the defense now. Best defense in the country goes to California for the least amount of yards allowed, just 9 yards under 4,000. California, and then you have Lafayette, Arkansas, Georgia State, and then you see TCU all the way down here, 4,300 total yards allowed. And then the best passing defense goes to Hawaii, Georgia State, and Southern Miss. And then the best rushing team, Florida, and then TCU, and then it's a big drop off after that. South Alabama's rushing defense was pretty good. Look at that. They made it into the top 3, but TCU and Florida really stuck out. Look at this, 111 yards more TCU has allowed than Florida. And then best scoring defense title goes to Florida Atlantic with 248, and then Florida with 260, and then you see TCU at the number 7 spot with 288. Clemson rounding off the top 10 with 292. And then this team had the most sacks, easily by far Florida, 12 more than everybody else. Ivy and Lance Harrison just great, 67 total. UCLA with 55, Arkansas and TCU with 52, and Tennessee at the bottom there, number 10 spot, 44. And then let's see who had the most fumble recoveries. That goes to Ball State, 13 fumble recoveries. That's 7 teams in the double digits: Notre Dame, Duke, Virginia Tech, North Carolina, BYU, and Arizona State. And which school had the most interceptions? The national championship winning team, Georgia, 21, and Pittsburgh had 21 as well, so we're tied for that spot. And then 2020 for Old Dominion, Colorado State, and Ohio State, and Hawaii and TCU with 19. So TCU's defense was pretty legit, 19 total interceptions. Alright guys, so it's time for some NFL Madden stats. So first we're going to start with the Colts, and then we'll go to the overall individual stats, and then we'll jump into the team to round it off. All right, so for the Colts, Samuel Mateo with 3,800 yards passing and 36 touchdowns, 26 interceptions. It's a lot of interceptions his rookie year. He's got to bring that number down. He did something similar in his first year in Miami, and then his second year in Miami, his last, he really brought that number down, and he was dangerous. So maybe we'll see. Let's see if he'll make that big jump in the NFL. 60% completion rate, 227 yards passing per game, and that number really went up towards the end of the season. And this was a big running team. So let's jump into that. Marlon Mack, 1,700 yards rushing, and then Jonathan Taylor, he had 3 to 4 starts towards the end of the season, and he ended up with 977. He broke the single game rushing record with 309, if I'm not mistaken, and he had 977 in total at the end. So and then Hines with 248, and then Mack with 10 touchdowns, Taylor with 12, and Hines with 1. And then Mateo had 121 rushing, and he had 6 total touchdowns, and Mack averaged 115 a game. And then Taylor, because of the the total games he played the starting games, he averaged 57. Of course, with this number, it's tough, like, who do you go with next season? We'll see what the Colts do. I think Marlon Mack is still the way to go. He did a great job in the Super Bowl, was the MVP, averaged 6.1 yards per carry this season, and Taylor with 8.1 with what he did. So it could be a 2-headed monster. It could be 3 with Hines thrown in there as well. And then this is a concerning number 2, fumbles, 8 for Samuel Mateo. So hopefully next season he can fix that turnover issue. This team won the Super Bowl at the end, but they have to get better in that. All right, now let's go to receiving stats. So Campbell led overall with 987, Pascal with 745, and then Hilton with 734, and Mack with 412. So did contribute somewhat to the passing game. 2 touchdowns for Mack, and then 7 for Campbell, 9 for Pascal, and 9 for T.Y. Hilton. Campbell was just 13 yards away from 1,000, and we're hoping to make that he makes that big jump next season, and he became Mateo's favorite target towards the end of the season. So it was Pascal in the beginning, then it was switched over to T.Y. Hilton towards the middle of the season, and then towards the end, Paris Campbell really took over, and he had that big playoff game against the Raiders, around 180 plus yards receiving. So he really torched them, and he's been a great deep threat, and he's proven it over and over again. And as the season progressed, the passing game got better and better and better. So next season, hopefully they can continue off that momentum and become a better passing team. You have a run game already, you have a good passing game, so and the Colts can become unstoppable. So now let's go over to the defense. Great defense this year. Total tackles, Darius Leonard and Bobby Okereke. He had a great season. 137 tackles, 121 respectively, and then tackles for loss, if you filter that, 14 for Leonard, 10 for Okereke. And then let's go to the sacks. Goes the other way for some reason. Buckner with 7, Casey with 7, and Pay, their rookie. Oh, sorry, he has 1 year experience. I think now that's because of the year 1 being over. He had 5 sacks as well. Leonard with 3, Okereke also had 3 sacks. So 2 really good linebackers for this team. So very, very good position for the Colts to be in. And then also for interceptions, Blackman, the free safety, with 5, Yassine with 4, 3 for Leonard. So tack on more for Leonard. Great linebacker for the Colts. And then Rhodes had 3. Okereke also had 2 interceptions thrown in there as well. So those 2 linebackers are competing for who's better. And then let's go to the punt return, kick return. Not great numbers. I mean, no touchdowns for kick or punt. But Rodgers had 308 for punting, and then almost 1,600, just 1 yard shy of 1,600 for kick returns, 24.6 average. So that's what he was able to do. And then let's go to now the overall stats for the league, the NFL, to see the stat leaders for passing. Let's go to passing first. I love doing this part, seeing the stat leaders towards the end of the season. Tom Brady, the only player over 5,000 yards. He had 5,217. And then Mahomes after him with 4,876. And Prescott took the Cowboys to the Super Bowl, 4,800 yards passing. So there's those guys. So it's the top 6 here. Aaron Rodgers at the bottom with 4,500. And then when you go to the touchdowns, Prescott with 44 and Mahomes with 40. And then you have Rodgers 38, Brady 37. Garoppolo had a really good season himself, 4,200 yards passing, 37 touchdowns, 11 interceptions. The Niners got into the playoffs, but they didn't make it too far. And then you have, they went to the divisional, I believe it was, and then the Packers took them down. So, and Mayfield also good season, 4,000 yards passing, 36 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. So he did really good turnover-wise. And then if you go to completion percentage, I believe that number goes to, it's gonna just anybody who's passed, so you can't really go off of that. Average yards per game, we can go off of that. Tom Brady 306, Mahomes 286, Prescott 282. And then who had the highest passer rating? That goes to Gardner Minshew again. It goes to pass completions and all that, so it doesn't take into account, the number of how much, the top players basically. But let's go to now who had the longest pass. Let's see who had the longest pass. That goes to Jameis Winston with 92 and Sam Darnold with 90, Allen with 90. Brady's up there with 84. The GOAT made his mark in the passing, longest pass this season as well. And now let's go to rushing. Who was the rushing leader? Nick Chubb. And Marlon Mack got injured in the last 3.5-4 games. So Nick Chubb took advantage and rushed for almost 1,700 yards, almost 1,800. 1,700 yards rushing, and Marlon Mack was 17. Elliott was 1,600. Henry also did well. McCaffrey and Kamara are in there as well, over 1,300 yards rushing. Who had the highest average yards per carry? Jonathan Taylor with 81. Again, just numbers a little you can't trust these numbers completely because it just doesn't take into account the top guys. One who had a lot of rushing yards. I'm not sure why it does that, but anyways, who had the most rushing touchdowns? Nick Chubb with 22, Elliott with 20, and then you see Kamara, Eckler, Barkley, and Jacobs. And then who had the rushing average per game? This number you can trust, of course. Marlon Mack 115, Nick Chubb 109 this game, and Cook, and then Mixon. So the top 4 there had over 100 yards. Mack, Chubb, Cook, and Mixon. All but Cook from the AFC. All right, and then who had the most fumbles this season? Samuel Mateo, 8, and then Sony Michel, the running back from the Patriots, 1,000 yards rushing, 9 touchdowns. He had 4 fumbles. And then let's go into receiving. Let's see who were the receiving leaders. All right, we have Allen Robinson, and well above everybody else, 1,500 yards receiving. Adams with 1,289. Got Davies up there for the Jets with 1,284. And then Metcalf, Evans, and Ridley round off those the top 6. And then you have let's see, average yards per game. Robinson 91.9, Ridley 83. Same order basically. Receiving touchdowns, who led? Let's see. You have Christian Kirk, 15 total touchdowns. He had a really good season. Went ahead of Robin in that category. Robinson had 11. Kittle and Evans also with 11, and then Adams and Chark Jr. with 10. And then let's go to defense now. Let's see the numbers here. So leading tackler this season, Matt Milano from the Bills. But he had the same amount as Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah from Notre Dame. It was his rookie season, and he led this Browns defense, 108. And then Jordan Hicks from the Cardinals with 108 as well. Solo tackles, and they all have the same amount of total tackles as well, 139 for them. Darius Leonard in there with 137. And then let's see who had the most tackles for loss. That goes to Vita Vea from the Buccaneers with 22. And then see Ogunjobi, Watt, Hendrickson, and Richardson up there in the 20s. And then QB sacks. Let's see who led with the QB sacks. Von Miller, 22.5 sacks this season. He went crazy. He was the defensive player of the year in the AFC. And then Myles Garrett with 21. And then Khalil Mack with 20 was the defensive player of the year in the NFC. So those three really stood out. Watt, Hayward, and Aaron Donald are in there as well. And then interceptions. Jason Verrett with 6. And then you have Darius Slay with 6. And Stephon Gilmore with 6. Matthew, Byron Jones, and Wilson, who's a linebacker for the Eagles, with 5. Let's see if there are any defensive touchdowns that we can count in here. Let's see who had the most. So Darius Leonard had a touchdown. Devin White, Justin Lane, Nickel, Roby Coleman, Ricardo Allen. So there's a whole bunch of players. I'm not going to go through the whole, but there were defensive touchdowns. No one had more than one. Alright, so this will be the last thing we do, looking at the team stats overall and see what teams did the best. So total offensive yards goes to the Cowboys. So Cowboys, Browns, and then the Colts at 3, Packers, Ravens, and Raiders. But the Cowboys the only team over 7,000. The Browns came close to getting 1,000. And then let's go to passing yards. That goes to the Buccaneers. Of course, we just saw those numbers. And then the Chiefs, Cowboys, Chargers, Raiders, and Packers. And then league leading in rushing yards were the Colts with 3,000 total rushing yards. Browns had 2,700. See the Cowboys, Ravens, Titans, and the Patriots. Patriots 2,000 to the Colts 3,000. So there's a big gap there. But the Colts, Browns, and Cowboys really stood out. And then points per game, who had the best offense? It goes to the Cowboys. And at the number 2 spot are the Colts. So 33.8 for the Cowboys, 32.1 for the Colts, and then the Browns were up there as well. It's just unfortunate what happened to the Browns in the playoffs. They lost to the Raiders 41-21, but they had a really good season overall. One of 3 teams to average over 30. The Packers, Chiefs, and 49ers round out the top 6. And then passing touchdowns, that goes to the Cowboys with 45, the Chiefs with 40, Packers, 49ers, Buccaneers, and the Colts. So Samuel Mateo, 36 touchdowns, helping the Colts into the top 6. Rushing touchdowns, that goes to the Browns. They had 39 total touchdowns. Look at this, 36 passing. They had more rushing touchdowns. They were very, very balanced offense. Vikings, Bengals, Cowboys, Colts once again up there with 29, and then the Ravens rounding out the top 6. And now let's go to the best defense, and this will be the last thing. Total yards allowed goes to the Patriots, and then you have the Seahawks, the Colts up there in the top 3, Ravens, Vikings, and Cowboys. Let's see who had the best passing defense. That goes to the Titans with just under 3,800. And you got the Bears, Jaguars are up there, Patriots, Seahawks, and Ravens. And then the Colts have the best run defense with under 1,200 yards. And then the Cowboys, Panthers, the Eagles are in there, Patriots, and Seahawks. The top 6 run defenses in the NFL. Points allowed were the best scoring defense. Patriots, the Colts at 2, but there's a big jump between the Patriots and the Colts. Look at that, 319 to 342. But then you go from the Colts to the next team, Colts to the Dolphins, and then it starts to even out after that, more balanced, 342 to 376. The Dolphins, Vikings, Chiefs, and the Cowboys. Which team led overall in sacks? That goes to the Broncos, thanks to Von Miller. You got Steelers up there with 48, Bucks, Cardinals, Browns, and Washington up there, rounding out the top 6. Teams with the most fumble recoveries, the Colts with 10. And then you got the Chargers, the Broncos, Bucks, Vikings, and Browns. And then interceptions, who led the league? That goes to the Colts, 26 interceptions. Got the Dolphins in there, the Eagles, one of 3 teams with 20 or more, and then the Texans, Jets, and the Titans.